Hi, I'm Vicky Lee Hurst. In my podcast, I chat with product leaders across the industry to share wisdom about building better products, better teams, and better careers. This podcast is an extension of my newsletter, which you can check out at vickyleehurst.com/newsletter. And today, I'm really excited to chat with Ruchi Munshi. Ruchi has had quite a career in building data products for healthcare and research. She was at the Broad Institute here in Cambridge, Massachusetts for 11 years, and her last role there was Associate Director of Product Management. She's now at Generate Biomedicines as Head of Product. Congrats, Ruchi, and tell us about yourself.
Hey, Vicky. Nice to chat again.
Yes.
So where do I start? My educational background is in biochemistry, so I spent a few years doing different types of sort of like wet lab work, working for different PIs, focusing in different areas. And that type of research is what brought me to the Broad Institute in first place, just like excited to see it done at like a ginormous scale and like, with a whole depth of expertise. And that same sort of scale is what opened me up to the world of like bioinformatics truly. And I was just like amazed by how much technology can impact biology. And that sort of inspired me to make a role change in the software engineering space. I did that for a few years, and that was fantastic. But my real realization in doing that work was that I got the most gratification when I was able to see that the thing I built was being used, even more so than building it itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those were like signals for me that like there's something else out there, and I happened to just learn more about product management. It was like coming to life in the Broad and like data sciences platform context. So I was really lucky to be in the right place at the right time for a lot of these transitions. And I've now been in the product space for many, many years, and I feel like it's an exciting place to be at this moment in time.
Yes, totally. Well, the product space is really exciting, and the products in biotech, healthcare, or life sciences is also really exciting. We said today we want to chat a little bit about just what exactly is product management, what exactly is a product manager in a biotech company. A little bit background on this is like Ruchi and I were both very interested in this question to begin with. And also during some of Ruchi's interviews, she was asked about this, by companies who have open recs in this role, because not everyone knows what that means, what a product manager really does in these type of companies. So we thought today we'll talk about this topic, but we're going to break it up into a couple different pieces. First, we're going to talk about like biotech, how we look at biotech. What do we mean when we say that word? We're going to talk about like the tech piece in particular in biotech. What does that look like? And then we're going to talk about like product management or product managers. Anytime I think we use the word like PM, we're talking about anybody who's doing this product management work. And then we're going to finally answer that question. What is a product manager in a biotech company? If we get lucky, we'll do one bonus question, but we'll start with a little bit more background and just definition clarification. What is really biotech when we use that word? How does it relate to other terms like pharma, healthcare tech, even life sciences? What's your take on that?
Yeah. Someone who's not like a super expert on the topic, but I'll give you a distillation of how I break these concepts down for myself. So I think like healthcare and life sciences is like a whole industry, which means that, it's dedicated towards very specific outcomes of like impacting human health. And like there's a ton of different company types that live within this vertical. And I think of biotech as like one of the many types of companies in the healthcare and life sciences space. I think what makes a biotech is that they probably have some kind of biological mechanism or biological pathway or some kind of like IP in that space that they can then apply and use to create some kind of therapeutics, drugs, medicine. So like that's their core factor. I think maybe more traditional pharmas operate differently. Yeah, the past history has been more around like you find these compounds, you test them against different cases, and then look for a match that could work for like you're looking for that specific lock and key match.
Mhm.
And so biotech is maybe just a different way of doing pharma and drug discovery in a nutshell. And
Mm.
it seems like a lot of companies are sort of making that, a lot of existing large pharmas are making that transformation. It's just um, at a different scale.
Mhm. Mhm.
Oh yeah, and you mentioned healthcare and like health tech, and I think like there are other companies that are less in the life sciencey space where their
Mhm.
like core IP is some kind of biological understanding,
Mhm.
but rather they're really thinking about how to improve other processes in the healthcare space, like
Yep.
patient experiences, either through like medical devices or like user experiences through technology.
Pharmacies.
Yes, exactly.
I
Pharmacies. That's a
often
great,
think about like Amazon pharmacies when I think about like
yeah,
healthcare tech. Um,
great
a
example.
lot of these like big companies are branching into that area, into the healthcare world, but just like a slice for the tech piece in healthcare, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So many.
So many. Yeah, totally. Okay. So that's what we were talking about in biotech companies. Let's zoom in like one step further, right? Like there's a tech in the biotech piece. How are we thinking about that tech piece?
Yeah.
What are some of the examples that we see in the industry?
All the examples are going to give that I'm going to give are influenced by my own sort of like interviewing journey and what I came across. I think probably the most common thread across all of them was like sort of a deep investment in sort of uh, LIMS and lab ops
Mm-hmm.
or lab informatic management systems and lab operations technology,
Mm-hmm.
which is like so important to them to be able to scale, whatever their like IP is to be able to run it in a wet lab context and like
Mm-hmm.
scale it. So I think that was a huge part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Another big part of it was also sort of like, once you've generated the data, what does it mean to analyze it? And so there's the computational side of it. I've often seen like a mixed investment for these companies. Some platforms they use off the shelf because there are
Mm-hmm.
solutions out there that can be leveraged, and then some of the work that they're doing feels very internal that they want to keep protected. So then they're investing in their own sort of computational informatics infrastructure as well.
Build versus buy.
Yeah, yeah, and like some of the stuff that they're doing is just niche. So
Right.
there's not solutions out there, but you're spending a lot of time integrating them or molding
But
them to fit your use case.
at the
So
end of the day, are you referring to the software in these lab ops, or more specifically, are you referring to the software that supports these R&D efforts?
yeah, exactly. Just
Mm-hmm.
like stuff that's supporting the R&D efforts.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like my brain often breaks it down into like sort of the wet lab side of the world, which includes like limbs, robotics, things like that. And
Mm-hmm.
then like the computational or dry lab side of the world, which will often include like how are they managing data? How are they managing any internal like analysis applications to work with that data? And what does it mean to be able to make sense of it all and
Mm-hmm.
catalog it? All that good stuff.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I think to add on top of that, like one trend I've been seeing with these companies is also like either asked by like VCs or some stakeholders, right, to make AI products, and that you have
Of
to
course.
have you have to have this like tech, the software tech piece, like AI based drug discovery, AI assisted some process, right? That I think this is a field that a lot of companies exploring. I am looking forward to see what's gonna like come out of this after a few months or even a few years. I think there are two other types when it comes to like software, right? Like the internal versus like the external. So you talk about the dry lab versus wet lab. I think that's a good distinction. And also another way to think about it is like internal versus external.
Hmm.
More and more companies are developing these like internal softwares that they realize like, oh, we can potentially commercialize it because our teams have found it so useful. Can we bring it to a product market? Can we find a product market fit out there? So it's almost like a commercialization effort to bring what's has worked internally to external companies. And I think another set is just like tools, platforms that is specifically developed to help biotech companies. Some people just call these like software, pure software to help. Some people call these like biotech software. However you name it, right? I think there's like many of them out there. Like benchling, as an example, is a good example here of like
Very
it,
popular one.
very
Yeah.
popular. Like at the end of the day, it is software, but their use cases are all for these like biotech specific.
Yeah, they're selling to biotech. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think those are also like two ways to look at like um, the
Tech and
software
biotech.
piece.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
tech
Yeah.
and biotech. Exactly. Okay, cool. So that's a little bit of a dive into biotech. Now let's look at the PM piece in this question, right? What does a PM do in the context of biotech? So what are who are these PMs? What do they do?
I think so I feel like the larger level answer, or like to me the most abstract answer for a PM anywhere is like, you know, define and like work towards outcomes. So there's
Mm-hmm.
that. And I think the added layer of complexity to all of that in the biotech context is that I think more often than not, biotech companies are building software for internal consumption. Like I think
Mm-hmm.
that tends to be the trend, or that's what I've observed as the trend.
Mm-hmm.
So the complexity there is that um, which outcomes matter the most needs a lot of alignment building and also connective tissue to understand which outcomes will impact what business goal and
Mm-hmm.
what company goal, and how do you align like a diverse set of stakeholders were involved on like picking which investment and where. So I feel like really aligning on outcomes I think is the challenging part of the work
Mm-hmm.
for a biotech PM, um, which is like a whole separate thing beyond just figuring out the right outcomes in the first place. So,
Yeah, I think that's pretty unique actually. Like in this industry, like the software piece is often like the second fiddle here, right? Like if you don't have the science, like the software is not that meaningful, especially for these like internal products that we're talking about,
yep,
right? It has to play almost like a enabler, supporter,
yes,
accelerator role.
accelerator role.
And that's why that business context, the scientific context, is super important. Otherwise, you're probably not solving the right problem for your company. And, picking the right problem to solve that aligns with your business goal and helps your customers and users is like the most core responsibility for a PM. So yeah, I think this is pretty unique for many PMs in our world.
Yeah, I feel like I just heard you say it's like, oh, the PMs have to figure out how their software will like impact science, which will then impact the company. So it's like
Mm-hmm.
impacting the science is also like a big part of the due diligence of that
Mm-hmm.
role, is like having
Mm-hmm.
a really clear understanding of that.
Yeah, I think so. Obviously, this depends on the specific roles, but a
For sure,
trend,
for sure.
yeah, like a trend that I'm seeing is like a lot of these companies, when they try to hire their founding PMs, especially like a first PM, they want someone that really understands the scientific aspect, because that is really important, right? Without that context, it's hard to connect it to the business goals.
Yeah. This is a quick sidetrack, but I think really smart people can pick up a lot of that domain faster than people would think. But I think in a small org context is like every bit of time saved feels like so valuable
Mm-hmm.
that, giving the idea that someone has to like ramp up on a domain that everyone else is already like fully, you know, has lived in for a decade probably
Mm-hmm.
feels like a hard shift. But
Mm-hmm.
I think I've always believed that like a really smart PM can hop in, not know the biology or all the other pieces there, but learn them fast enough to contribute. But yeah,
I think that's true. I think that's true. I mean, like the biology is, even if you have a degree in some kind of like biology, biochemistry, right? There is still like lots of nuances once you get into that. Like, my personal experience when I first got into like the single cell space, like I knew nothing about single cell. I have a degree in bioinformatics, but I think that helped me learn faster, but it didn't help me know like single cell on day one. You still have to like read the papers, know what are the popular tools, know how people analyze their data, what kind of data is being generated.
yeah,
I think it's fair to say like no matter whether you have a science degree or a background or not, like you still have to dive
Learn.
into. Yeah,
Yes.
you have to learn that specific domain you're in. You may be able to learn a little bit faster because you have seen this in a different context and maybe
Yeah.
not the exact same one. But we all have to learn in order to do a good job product managing.
Makes sense. I totally
Mm-hmm.
agree.
Mm-hmm. Anything else about what PMs actually do in the context of a biotech company?
I think so a lot of it is, I think the biggest thing is what we've talked about is like understanding that business context, understanding the science, and like
Mm-hmm.
sort of marrying all the pieces together.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think the other piece really here is that, it's so easy for, even in a biotech, I think it's so easy to be a PM where people come to you with features and they're
Mm.
like, great, I'm a deep expert in this operation or in this task. Like, trust me, this is a thing that you should build. And I think even in that context is like, again, once you've immersed yourself enough in the science, you have enough of the information to be able to say, oh, okay, can you explain more
Mm-hmm.
about what's actually not working here? And, I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of your time is spent sort of like peeling away the layers to figure out what is the root cause. And I think that's probably common everywhere, but it's like you have to, again, that added layer of science that you're also peeling away to understand, or like something about the nuance of the lab, because the lab also has lots of automation. So there's other things in the picture that you're understanding to make sense of it all. But I think, really just understanding user needs, where your users are scientists and they're dealing with a lot of other things. So like,
Mm-hmm.
spending extra time, I think, to get crystal clear on what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think at the end of it all, getting people to focus and meet a, a focus on a goal and meet that outcome versus like the desire versus like there's so many cool things we could be building,
Mm-hmm.
how not to build cool things but how to focus on the impactful things, I think continues being so important, especially I think in a biotech space where there's so many open source tools and opportunities and like options out there that can inspire, again, ideas. But the idea being that like how do we do the validation to make sure that the thing we're about to invest in is going to be impactful?
Mm-hmm.
I think, again, that sort of like that validate before you build. And so like understanding the outcomes and getting that validation, I think,
Mm-hmm.
especially in a world where like your open sourced or even like paid options are kind of limitless. So figuring out like which outcomes to focus on. And again, inherent to that is a lot of buy versus build within it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And even with like that validation, like what is like the quickest, cheapest thing possible? I think there's like a art and science to this question as well, right? Like you don't want your validation to take on the order of like years, right? That could be very expensive for the company. What are like some small things that you can do, if possible, that give you enough signal to make a decision, and then you keep iterate from the results and the outcomes you get from that. I think that's it comes with a lot of practice.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like people underestimate how much science goes into product management. Although I
Hmm.
think a biotech company is really open to the idea, right? I think it's like, I don't think this analogy works perfectly, but sometimes I try to like simplify it all as like, hey, I also do research, but the things I do research are on people and
Hmm.
their journeys and their
Hmm.
processes, or organizations and their goals, and like understanding those pieces and marrying those pieces. But like, so like I'm also a research scientist. It's just my subject matter is very different from yours.
Yep.
But like I'm also applying like the same concepts of like setting out hypotheses,
Yep.
testing them quickly and cheaply, like you
Hmm.
said. And I think that tends to resonate, if I'm talking to a
Hmm.
non-technical or non like traditional tech org kind of people who were deep in like their research science and they're trying to understand what you do. I
Yep.
think that resonates. But my favorite answer is really just saying like, hey, I want to build things that are useful and usable by
Hmm.
you.
Hmm.
And like those are the two things I think about a lot above
Hmm.
all else.
Yes, yes, yes. You want to add value. You want to
Exactly.
solve someone's burning question, someone's burning problem, right? And make their life easier. And that's why you're building a product, why you're developing software. I thought of something when oh yeah, that this whole like I'm also developing hypothesis. I have the same experience. Like it resonates really well with these like biotech companies, even for companies that haven't had like product practices really. When you talk to like a bioinformatician or like lab scientist, like, okay, this is how we're thinking about doing this work similar to what you do. We're also gonna like write this hypothesis, and we're gonna design our experiment, and we're gonna like analyze the results and then go back to see the hypothesis, if that is a positive or negative hypothesis, right? I think that resonates really well because scientists do like to think that way. So that's a very cool like coincidence in the science discipline and also like the product management discipline.
Totally.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Cool. So like on the topic of like, okay, what does a product manager do, right? Oftentimes, especially in biotech companies, there isn't a person whose title is product manager or head of product, but somebody is doing the product work. And I say that because if nobody's doing the product work, you probably don't have a business, right? What we mean by product work is like figuring out, again, earlier we said this, like figuring out what is the right problem to solve that adds value to your customer and aligns with your business goals, right? That's the fundamental piece of your business. So somebody must be taking on that role, even if they aren't product managers by their title. They just wear that hat.
Yeah.
I think the most common person taking on that role, especially for earlier stage companies, is actually the CEO themselves, because that's what they think about a lot. And of course there are like director of bioinformatics also taking on that role. I'm curious in your experience if you've seen like other people in that position as well.
Yeah. I totally agree, right? It's like, I don't think any company can exist without, like software at its heart. So like someone is making those decisions. I think what I've probably seen is maybe director of bioinformatics the most, because I think early on in this journey, a lot of companies probably just buy software or, build software stacks based on enterprise solutions. I can sort of help them get started or do something. It doesn't even have to be efficient, just like get them off the ground. And so then the places I think where they invest that thinking of like what will accelerate our business often ends up being on the bioinformatics side. So I think that's where like the kind of product thinking we're talking about of like ideation, testing, I think really with whoever is like the leader in the bioinformatics space, or like if it's not biology, if it's some other company, then chemical informatics or whatever.
Yeah. This is like really interesting because I recently had a conversation with someone just in like product management in general tech, and they were sharing their observation of the role of chief product officer, CPO, has becoming a lot more common over the past like 3 to 5 years than it used to be. And I was reflecting on that. I was like, that is really interesting because now even in early stage biotech companies, still not as many, right, as like the tech industry, I think. But I have like met CPOs now, even before they hired their like full team and whatnot. I think that's really interesting. Like, how do you view that phenomenon?
Yeah. It's to me that must mean that like I think to me that must mean that there's a signal of like very clear like vision planning they have to do from a digital investment or technical investment standpoint. So it's like a function they build early on because they need a really strong foundation to do the rest. And so I think maybe in the advent of like machine learning and artificial intelligence and all the things that are possible, maybe it's like sort of a signal for an early investment in thinking about that or other places of business growth that they're like just trying to get ahead of maybe. And you're like, how do you put this in like the soul of the company from the start?
Yeah, I think this is also going to be a trend that I'm going to keep a close eye in the next couple of years. It's very interesting. I want to see like how these companies make decisions that may be different than companies that, rely on like the CEO, the CSO, the CTO only. So this will be an interesting case study in a couple of years.
Yeah, you're saying like how do they fare versus the alternative?
How do they what?
Like you're saying, you're curious to understand how do the companies with the CPOs perform over many, many years versus the ones not. Yeah. I mean, I would love to read that article. So,
all right,
sign me up.
Subscribe now and then wait a couple years. Awesome. Okay. So I think in terms of that question, what is a product manager in a biotech company? We'll kind of tease it apart in different pieces. Why don't you share with us, if you feel comfortable, like, how did you answer that question in interviews? How did you, I think there's one piece, and this is like a general advice in interviews. When people ask you in an interview, like, what is a product manager in a biotech company? They're asking you that question, but not really just asking you that question. There's always like an underlying purpose.
Yeah.
It may be like, why do we need to pay someone doing this work? Or maybe like, how does this add value to us exactly, right? There's always that underlying question they're trying to get from your answer. And there is a big difference in terms of how people answer that, whether you think about their true purpose in asking that question or just like looking at it on the surface. You clearly performed really well in your interviews for landing in this role. So I was wondering if you could share with our audience here a little bit, like how you thought about that question, how you approached it, how did they receive that?
Yeah. Great question. It's funny because I feel like that answer evolves for me with every subsequent interview. Like it just gets better, or it just gets like shorter and shorter. I feel like
Practice makes perfect. Yeah.
I like starting with the basics. I'm like, oh, I'll always start with like, I feel like a PM's job is to ensure success of a product. And when I say success of a product, I mean like something that your users are using, that they like using. You have a sense for like what goal you're trying to meet, and then like measuring them and meeting them. So you're confident that the product is being successful based on like the company goals. And then, I think what people are really trying to get to is like, well, what are you going to do specifically in all of that? Like,
Right.
That's cool. A lot of that involves writing code, but what are you going to do in all of that? And I think, so the layer I like adding on is like, I, I think a big part, I think a big part of what a PM provides is a business context. So like giving that understanding of like, an engineering team spends a lot of their time heads down. So I feel like I feel like a PM's job is to spend a lot of time heads up. Gather, synthesize, send back. So I feel like that's a big part of like something I would want to do on like a week to week basis, but kind of get into the nitty gritty of that is like, oh yeah, like get that information, give examples for like, what kind of outcomes am I talking about? Go from theory to practice. I try to do it in like a format where I ask some questions like, oh, great. Like, do you have a sense for what your company goals are? Great. Awesome.
This is to ask the engineers.
Yes, exactly. And then I'll be like, great. So then tell me what is the work you're doing that connects to the company goals? And I feel like as we descend that level of understanding, it gives me a sense of like, oh, how much of this is happening, but also helping them understand that this is like, this is one way for things to operate. And like, that is what I know and understand. And that is what I can bring to you is like this ability to sort of bring connective tissue, help you validate value in something before you build it, give them examples of how it's can happen. And then also like on the execution front, what kind of like support role I can play from like a process standpoint. But, and that's where the answer starts deviating wildly.
That's really great. I think a lot of companies like to optimize for like engineering productivity. And what I mean by that is like, every sprint they're shipping out something and they're happy about that. Like that usually is a sign of job well done. And a lot of companies kind of like stop at that point. But I like how you have been taking it one step further to understand and assess like how well does the engineering team understand the bigger picture? Like why are they doing this work? What is the bigger context? What outcome is exactly being enabled? So it's less about like, oh, a feature gets shipped, we check a box, we celebrate, but more about like, okay, this feature gets shipped, but that is not the only goal, right? We had said something else earlier. Maybe it's about improving the efficiencies of our scientists. Maybe it's about something else. Let's also monitor that and really measure what the impact of our feature or our product becomes. I think that gives everybody else a purpose as well, right? Like,
well, it lets them ponder that question, the same question they're asking me, just at a deeper level. And my favorite thing to conclude with is like a failure story. Actually, it's like worked for weeks or months building a thing, I thought I understood the value proposition. It went out the door and it fell on its face.
Mm,
Like I did not meet the outcome I intended. What did I learn? Because I think what happens is like, as you get good at product management, it's not that that goes away, it just happens less and less, I think.
mm,
And I think that's something someone else can resonate with,
mm,
like that story. Because then they're asking themselves in the last year or two, what we've built, how much of that was impactful?
mm,
And that should make them think, if a lot of it was impactful, I would I would say they don't need a PM. Like if they're
mm,
having a lot of high impact, then they're like the right group of individuals who bring the right expertise and they're good. But if they're not, then I think they're really well positioned to benefit from like product practices and
mhm.
slowing down and some of that product thinking.
Yes, yes. And I think by nature, like I think some of these engineers could play the PM role and could
Absolutely.
do a good job. But
Absolutely.
by nature of like the distinction you made earlier, right? The engineers are really heads down. Just by nature of like you are looking at the details. You are trying to figure out the nitty-gritty. And the people in the PM role are like looking up, right? Looking at the bigger context, the impact. It's hard to hold those two sides of the same coin in your head at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's why like this role exists, right?
Yes. Yes.
And I think for companies especially struggling with like making an impact, and by that it could mean like they're failing to find their product market fit, or their product is stalling, they're not growing, right? Like they're seeing any of those symptoms. It could just be that they need somebody more dedicated to think about these questions than the existing like team structure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool. Right, great answer. Thank you for sharing with us. I think the bonus question that we had said was like product management came out of tech, right? That's some people think that's what made these like really famous tech companies as successful as they are today. Um, what are some like tech best practices in product management that doesn't really work in biotech, or like doesn't translate to the same level of impact in biotech, right? Like if tech product management is so successful, why can't we just take it off the shelf and apply it in our biotech setting?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sure there are lots, but let's talk about one today.
Yeah. It's funny because I feel like another sort of leading question I'll get or have gotten in my interviews in the past was like, what do you think about OKRs?
Mm,
You know? And to me, like, that's a sense of either like the company has tried and like
they hate
did
it.
not like it or it didn't work. So they're like, what do you think about OKRs?
Yeah, yeah,
Or like they read an article and they're like, what do you think about
yeah,
OKRs?
yep,
Something, something product, something OKRs.
yep.
And so in either case, I feel like I think the um I think the answer I like to give is like it's not about the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. Yeah, like the intent of the OKRs is to like I think twofold. The intent of the OKRs is to make sure that you're thinking about that end outcome. So
Mm-hmm.
it is like a little bit of it I think is an accountability framework to make sure we're thinking about progress indicators, excuse me, or like what outcomes and objectives we're going after. So it creates that space and time to think and communicate. And I think the other piece about it all is that it serves as an alignment function. Gets people in a room, you argue, you counter each other. That's all healthy and good. So I feel
Mm-hmm.
like it's like if you're following those two things, as long as you're doing it at a cadence that makes sense for your organization,
Mm-hmm.
like quarterly, twice a year, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
as long as you're like spiritually living the ideas behind it, I think like that's great. Whether you have to do it in the exact same format that like Google will do OKRs, that's probably not necessary. And in fact, when people try to like copy paste that, I think is where it all starts falling
Yep.
apart.
Yep.
And so I think like I like to say it as like, oh, we should set goals and we should have a planning process and like, you know, what that looks like is like a joint decision on what feels right. And we
Mm-hmm.
experiment and try different processes organizationally. Something
Mm-hmm.
will eventually click.
Yep.
But like, I'll defend them in the sense that I'm like, you got to set objectives,
Right.
period.
Right. Whether you use this format and do it quarterly,
Yes,
that's
exactly.
business
Unless,
specific.
exactly, not married to that.
Right,
So,
right, right. I think that's a great example. I feel like a lot of these frameworks in tech product management got very
yes.
famous, right? OKR, objective key results, should have said that earlier. Objectives and key results, or like PRFAQ, press release, frequently asked question. Like all of these, the acronyms got really famous. But I think the gist here is like understand the concept, right? Like PRFAQ is like you work backwards, use as an alignment tool. You think about from the customer's perspective. All of these really make sense no matter what industry you're in. Whether or not you want to write like a 5-pager or a half-pager, that is your own discretion, and use, let the tool serve you, right? And not be so attached,
Rigid. Yeah.
rigid about that like specific format and
Yeah.
the
Well, Jeff
the
Bezos
letters.
does this.
That's right. There you go. Awesome. Cool. Yeah, I think that was a great discussion. I just want to like also mention at the end, if you're a product person in biotech and are interested in like community practice conversations, anything like product and biotech related, like talk to Ruchi. She's a really fantastic person to chat with.
Thanks, Vicky.
Yeah. Awesome. Anything else before we end this episode?
No, this was enlightening. Even just like having some dialogue about this is like just exciting because the community's small.
Yeah.
So, we got to find each other.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I enjoyed it thoroughly. I would always love to do this more. Thank you for your time. We'll chat again soon.
Take care.
Okay. Bye.